Welcome to another episode of Grammar is Power. In this short, second of 3 videos, you'll learn about the implied relative pronouns and how to avoid a common pronoun reference problem. In part 1, we covered the definition of adjective clauses, or as some call them, relative clauses. And you learned about the most common relative pronouns, including the unique relative possessive, whose. To understand the implied pronoun concept, first we'll look at the implied you in requests and commands. In this sentence, we see give as an action verb. The next step is to ask who or what gives to find the subject. Since the subject is an imperative, a command or request, the subject is understood as you. When we parse the sentence, we write the implied you in parentheses. But we aren't finished with this sentence. There is another subject-verb combination, you-o. When we look at how the two clauses are joined, we don't see a semicolon or a conjunction, so something else has to be going on. To continue our process, you owe what? The answer would seem to be money, but money is the clear direct object in the first clause, and one noun cannot serve two functions in the same sentence. When you reach this step, check to see if adding that, who, or whom at the beginning of the clause makes sense. Here, the implied that starts the adjective clause, stands in for money, and serves as the direct object in its clause. Let's look at a few more examples. What are the two subject-verb combinations in this sentence? When we parse the sentence, we have two clauses. Alfred is someone, a pattern 2, and Batman can't trust, a seeming pattern 4. But it doesn't seem complete. Then we notice there is nothing joining the two clauses, so we try that. The sentence makes sense with that, but since the antecedent is someone, an indefinite pronoun standing in for Alfred, a person, we use who. Then we figure out that the implied relative pronoun is the direct object, so we have to use the objective case whom instead. The relative pronoun whom begins the adjective clause that describes someone and functions as the direct object in its own clause. One more example. What are the two subject-verb combinations in this sentence? George should follow the plan and the team created for the heist. Again, after parsing, we notice two clauses joined by nothing. The implied that begins the adjective clause that describes the plan and serves as the direct object in its clause. Follow the directions on the handout to parse this sentence. Pause the video as you work and correct in a different color. The independent clause is, the new car will have the best safety features. Car is the subject, will have is the verb phrase, and features is the direct object. The relative clause that she wants for her daughter describes the car. It begins with the relative pronoun that, which stands in for the car, and functions as the direct object in its own clause. An implied relative pronoun that stands in for features and functions as the direct object in its own clause. Let's move on to a common problem. The relative pronoun which is the source of numerous pronoun reference errors in writing. You already know that pronouns must have clear antecedents. An adjective clause that starts with which must modify the noun or pronoun right in front of it. Which cannot refer to a general situation or to two or more possible antecedents in a sentence. Read this sentence and find the relative clause. There are two independent clauses. Loki breaks the timeline and the time variance authority captures him, joined by so. The sentence ends with the relative clause beginning with which. However, the pronoun right in front of this dependent clause is him, and which helps repair the timeline is not telling us any information about him. What, in fact, does which stand in for? Seemingly nothing. We can fix the error by revising the sentence so that a clear pronoun appears in front of the relative clause. Now, which stands in for the choice and functions as the subject in the adjective clause that tells what kind of choice. Follow the directions on the handout to parse the sentence and edit any pronoun errors. Let's start with the independent clause. Loki joins an ATV mission and confronts an alternative version of himself. Loki is the subject of the compound verbs joins and confronts. Each of the verbs has its own direct object. Loki joins mission and Loki confronts version. This relative clause describes Loki with who as the subject and gender fluid as a predicate adjective following the be verb. The second relative clause describes the mission, which stands in for mission and functions as the subject of the action verb takes. Him is the direct object. The sentence ends with the problematic relative clause. As it is written, which is the subject, Starts is the action verb, and him is the direct object. The pronoun in front of which is himself. In this case, a reflexive pronoun functioning as the object of an adjectival prepositional phrase. Which starts him on a wild adventure through human history does not describe himself, so there's a pronoun reference problem. One way to revise the sentence is shown here. Break up the sentence with a semicolon and replace the pronoun with a noun, this encounter, for the verb starts. And that concludes this video. See you in the next one on punctuation of adjective clauses.